and welcome to Beyond the Knife, a medical history podcast brought to you by Surgeons Hall, Museums, Library and Archives. We are part of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh. I am Chanté, Director of Heritage and Estates at the college. Each episode, I'm joined by a guest who shares a story from the history of medicine and surgery. This episode contains discussions on topics that some people may find distressing. Please take care while listening. For thousands of years, people have been fascinated by how we learn about the human body. From ancient times to today, clear and accurate images of anatomy have been an essential tool. Today, tools like medical imaging and 3D printing have changed how we study the body. But long before that, medical artists helped shape our understanding, and they continue to play a vital role in healthcare today. In April 2025, Surgeons Hall will proudly host the annual conference of the Medical Artists Association of Great Britain, the MAA. This association was founded in 1949 when medical artistry was officially recognised as a profession in the UK. However, its roots go back thousands of years to the anatomical artwork of ancient Egypt, Arabia, Greece, China and India. On the podcast today, we're delighted to welcome Danielle Dray, Collections Coordinator at Surgeons Hall Museums here, who will take us through the fascinating history of medical art in the UK, highlighting too some of the pioneering women who helped shape and preserve this vital profession. Danielle, welcome to the podcast. Danielle, you are Collections Coordinator here at Surgeons Hall Museum.
I am.
And we are talking today about women pioneers in medical art. So Danielle, as a warm-up question, tell us about if you could be present in any moment in medical history, what would it be and why?
I think probably the moment that Röntgen discovered the potential of X-rays. I mean, he'd been doing these kind of tests on them for a while, and he realized that they would be useful for medical practice. And I think being there for that kind of eureka moment would have been really cool. But there's also that part of me that wishes that when these X-ray pioneers were kind of experimenting with it and kind of developing these techniques for X-ray imaging, there had been someone there to say, okay, this is amazing, guys, but please stop putting your hands in there.
Putting your hands in there?
Yeah, they used to kind of experiment and calibrate the equipment on themselves, like using their hands and their arms. So a lot of these early X-ray pioneers ended up losing their hands, losing their arms, dying of cancers, radiation poisoning. So there is that part of me that, although it was amazing work and it would have been so cool to see, I do wish someone had been able to warn them of that.
You would have been the person there advising on the rest.
Yeah, it's like, no, don't put your hand in there.
So Danielle, a perfect intro to medical art. So when we talk about medical art, what is it? What are we talking about?
Well, it's basically creating illustrations that can demonstrate medical or surgical things that can be quite difficult to explain if you're only trying to use words. So a medical artist is a bit of a visual problem solver in a way. So taking something that's really quite complex and presenting it in a way that can be really easily understood. So quite a good example of this is something like Gray's Anatomy. So that was first published in 1858. But this is still one of the foremost texts for teaching anatomy because the illustrations are so clear and they make these really difficult concepts easy to understand.
Okay. And how long has it been around for?
Well, we have evidence of rudimentary surgical procedures being illustrated on papyrus from ancient Egypt. So it's been around for, millennia, really. What we think of as medical art in a more modern sense, we can more or less pinpoint to kind of the 15th, 16th century, particularly with works like Andreas Vesalis's De Humani Corpus Fabrica. So at this point, medical illustrations and art were tending to focus on anatomical structures or particular pathologies.
And why is that?
So basically until the middle of the 18th century, so 1702 in Scotland, 1752 in England, when we get the Murder Act, medical students couldn't actually take part in dissections very often and actually see inside the body for themselves. So they were entirely dependent on illustrations in these textbooks to be able to actually learn anatomy. This was, of course, also a time before cameras and photography. So the only way to demonstrate a particular piece of anatomy or to capture an interesting piece of pathology was to draw it. So a lot of surgeons during this period actually did have quite a high degree of artistic talent, and a lot of them did illustrate things that they came across during their work, and then they would use these in their publications and also share them with other surgeons and their students.
Gosh, and I know that in that period, this is quite an exclusive male space when we talk about medicine and surgery. Were there female artists as well, or is it predominantly men?
At that point, it is predominantly men. So during this period, most doctors did come from quite wealthy backgrounds, and they enjoyed what we might call something like a classical education. So at that point, a gentleman would be expected to include things like art and music and languages as part of their overall education. So many of the men that were entering the medical field did have some degree of artistic training.
So to be a gentleman, even a medical gentleman, you needed some artistic training.
Oh yes, you had to be cultured.
So what changed?
Well, a couple of factors. Firstly, there's a general kind of shift in the way that education is done towards the beginning of the 20th century. So there's a general kind of reduction in these sort of gentlemanly pursuits. So it meant that men that were entering the medical field didn't tend to have the same degree of artistic training that had previously been seen. So that's when they start to become a bit more reliant on actually trained artists to be able to produce these illustrations for them because they no longer really have the talent to do it themselves.
Okay. And I know that World War One, so thinking about how we're developing through history, World War One played a really important role in women starting to access the medical sphere. Is that true in terms of art as well?
Yeah, so the World War One is probably one of the biggest catalysts for that change that begin to see. So obviously with the outbreak of the war, there's a lot of people that need to be trained really quickly in things that they probably haven't ever done before. So that applied to a whole range of fields, so engineering, communications, and also particularly in medicine and surgery. So with the new kind of weaponry that was being used during the First World War and also the sheer scale of the fighting, surgeons were coming across injuries that were unlike anything that they'd seen before, and they needed a way to record it. So medical artists became really, really important because not only did they need to capture the new injuries that these surgeons were seeing, but also trying to illustrate the new surgeries that they were developing to try and heal those injuries.
Wow. And they couldn't just take photographs?
They did sometimes, yeah. So probably the most famous example of this is the before and after photographs for things like facial reconstruction surgery. However, at this point, early cameras and photographic equipment did have a lot of limitations. So firstly, they're quite bulky, so not really something that you can easily fit into a field operating theatre. You imagine it's getting in the surgeon's way, it's blocking his light, like it's just not very practical. Early cameras were also not very good at capturing particularly small details, and those were often really critical to what the surgeon was actually trying to demonstrate. So this is where medical artists became really vital because they could capture and highlight what a camera couldn't.
And when it comes to those illustrative techniques, so thinking about that fine detail or that need for fine detail that you just described, did they develop techniques specifically to meet that need?
Yeah, so this is where Max Brodel comes in. He's a very famous man. He's sometimes known as the father of modern medical illustration. So he was born in Leipzig, and then in 1894 he moved over to Baltimore to accept a post at Johns Hopkins, where he'd been commissioned to illustrate some pioneering abdominal surgeries that were being undertaken by Dr. Howard Kelly. Now, Brodel had mainly trained as a lithographer, and while he was, of course, a very talented artist, he quickly found that the traditional mediums that he was used to using, so things like pencils, watercolors, inks, they weren't really good enough for him to capture the complex textures of living organs and living tissues. So he came up with a new technique. And this is what he called the Rossboard technique. And Basically, this is done by creating an outline of what you want to draw on tracing paper, and then you use that to leave an imprint on your Ross board, which is a heavy card that's covered in either chalk or china clay. You then use carbon dust, which is similar to graphite powder, and use a brush to very slowly build up these layers, and that helps to develop the sense of depth. Then for like highlights, you can either use white ink, or Brodel himself actually liked to use a scalpel to just scrape away the areas of carbon dust. And then for your final details like labeling and stitches, you just etch them in with a little bit of black ink. And the images that he created using this technique were completely different to any other kind of medical illustration that had been completed before that. And surgeons like immediately recognized that this was absolutely perfect for illustrating surgeries.
So, Danielle, how did Bodel's technique come to the UK?
So this is where Audrey Arnott comes in. She's actually really central for the development of British medical art. So she originally started her career working in London with a neurosurgeon called Hugh Cairns. Now, Cairns had also studied in Boston with Harvey Cushing, so he was quite aware of Brodel's work, and he thought that it was absolutely perfect for illustrating neurosurgery. So Brodel had started a course for medical illustration at Johns Hopkins in 1911. So in 1932, Cairns actually sent Arnott over to Johns Hopkins to learn the Rossboard technique from Brodel himself. Now, she is the only British student that he ever taught, so she was the one who actually brought Brodel's technique back to the UK.
Wow, and is that partly why she was so important?
Absolutely, yeah. So she also played a very important role within Hugh Cairns' team, and I often think a little bit of an overlooked role. So Cairns was very much a pioneer in his field. He was a neurosurgeon that specialized particularly in head injuries. So he toured very extensively, giving talks and lectures about the new techniques that he was developing. And all of his surgeries were illustrated by Audrey Arnott. So she would be right beside him in the operating theatre, like sketching away as he worked, which is not an easy thing to do. But this also meant that with these illustrations, not only did it mean that Cairns's techniques could be easily explained and passed on to other surgeons who then may want to try these techniques, but it also demonstrated the benefits of that kind of illustration to other surgeons.
Gosh, so did other surgeons see this and think, I want to do this too?
Yes, absolutely. So one in particular is Norman Dott, again, another pioneering neurosurgeon. And at that time, he was working with an artist called Margaret McClarty. So once Arnott had returned to the UK, Norman Dott suggested that McClarty should go down to London and actually learn the Rossboard technique from her. This did backfire a little bit, however, because when Margaret McClarty actually got to London and met Audrey Arnott, she decided that she didn't want to come back and that she would rather stay in London and continue working with Audrey Arnott. They actually became lifelong friends and companions, so they worked together, they lived together, they even retired together. So Norman Dott kind of missed out on McClarty's skills there. He actually ended up working with a couple of other artists to illustrate his work. The Canadian Hester Tom, who had also been a student of Brodel, and Clifford Shepley, who again was a very early adopter of the Rossboard technique.
And what about McClarty?
Well, after she moved to London, she continued to work with Hugh Cairns. Then in 1938, Cairns moved to Oxford, where he started the Nuffield Department of Surgery, and both Arnott and McClarty both went with him. Audrey Arnott continued to work with Hugh Cairns on neurosurgery, and Margaret McClarty was assigned to the Department of Anaesthetics, and she produced an absolutely staggering number of illustrations while she was in this role, and she helped to provide illustrations for some very prominent textbooks, so notably Bailey's Surgery of Modern Warfare was one that Margaret McClarty worked quite extensively on.
Were there other women working in the field of medical illustration at this time?
So by 1948, there were around 40 medical artists that were working in the UK, and most of them actually were women. Probably one of the best known is Dorothy Davison, and she was based down in Manchester. So, like a lot of other medical artists at that time, she didn't actually begin her career in medicine. She actually started her career in museums. So, she used to work at Manchester University Museum, where she gave lectures to school children on Egyptology. And she used to illustrate these with her own models and paintings that she had done herself. So these caught the attention of Grafton Elliott Smith, who, as well as being a fellow keen Egyptologist, was also professor of anatomy at Manchester Medical School. So seeing her artwork, he was obviously very impressed, and he offered her a post in the anatomy department to draw specimens for him, which she obviously accepted. Then in 1920, Geoffrey Jefferson joins Manchester Medical School as a neurosurgeon. And again, he sees Davidson's work and is really impressed. So in 1939, Jefferson is made the UK's first professor of neurosurgery, and he offers Davison an official contract as a medical illustrator. And that's quite a big deal at that time because during this period, most medical artists are working kind of a freelance ad hoc basis. So to be given an official contract was actually quite rare. So I think really a testament to Davison's skill.
And women artists working in this field at the time, Davis and Arnott, were they well respected?
Yes and no. So these ones that were working with highly prominent and influential surgeons, so people like Arnott, McClarty, and Davidson, they were very well thought of, very well respected, in high demand, but they were arguably in quite a privileged position. So a lot of medical artists at this time weren't actually viewed as professionals. They were kind of seen as on par with someone like a secretary or a clerk. And this was in part due to a lack of formal qualifications for medical illustrators. So while a lot of them had gone to art colleges and things like that and did hold qualifications from there, they weren't seen as equivalent to something like a BA or a BSc from a university. So it meant that medical artists were often kind of viewed as amateurs. On the other hand, men didn't generally have that problem. So university education was a lot more accessible for men. And at this point, a lot of male medical artists were also men who had served in some capacity in the military during either the First World War or the Second World War. And within a social context, that afforded them a lot more respect than would generally be afforded to women. So all of this kind of meant that women were also generally quite underpaid compared to their male counterparts.
Did they advocate to change that?
Yeah, absolutely. So over in the US, the Association of Medical Illustrators had started in 1945, and by 1948, it had 87 active members, which is quite impressive. So this was the inspiration for Dorothy Davison to try and set up something similar for medical artists who are based in the UK. So she obviously had a few ideas in mind when she was starting to explore this. 1948 was also a big year for British healthcare because that was the beginning of the NHS. So with this new kind of structure of how healthcare was being provided, it meant that a lot of hospitals were beginning to restructure. So individual doctors and surgeons had a lot less say in how things were done. So the influence that surgeons like Dot and Kens and Jefferson had enjoyed was kind of beginning to wane. And this was bad news for medical artists because these are the men that had been advocating for them and their skills. So that was very quickly going away. Photography also at this point was much better developed, and it was often seen as quicker to just hire a photographer than to get a medical artist because a photographer could take and develop a film within a day or so, whereas a medical artist could take several days to complete one illustration. At this point, a lot of medical art departments are actually beginning to close as well, not just because of the cost, but because by this point there were actually a lot of posts for medical artists that were falling vacant because there were so few artists that actually had the required skill set to be able to take up those posts. So while there were around 40 artists in the UK at that point, a lot of them were beginning to age. I mean, by 1948, Dorothy Davison was almost 60. So there was a very real risk that these skills were kind of going to age out with them, and there was no one to kind of come up and replace them in a way. So Dorothy Davidson and Clifford Shepley actually corresponded quite a lot about this issue. And one of the things that really stood out from their correspondence was they were quite concerned with the variation in the style and the standard of artwork that was being produced at this point. And this was mostly because, like I said, most medical artists were not from medical backgrounds, so they kind of just had to learn on the job. And there was no formal qualification available for that. So one of the ideas that they had when they were putting together this association was that maybe they could provide some sort of formal training and a qualification that would then elevate the status of medical artists.
And was that a success?
In many ways, yes. So the first meeting of the Medical Artists Association of Great Britain was held on the 2nd of April 1949, and there were 24 artists in attendance. So that consisted of 7 men and 17 women, and they became the founding members of the MAA. So one of the first things, Clifford Shepley established a medical illustration course at the University of Edinburgh, to which he was attached. So this is one of the first ways that medical illustrators in the UK could obtain a university level qualification. However, not everyone could go to Edinburgh and spend an extended period of time there. So other MAA members also offered traineeships and apprenticeships whenever they could. So Dorothy Davison, again, was particularly instrumental in this. She took trainees at Manchester Royal Hospital right up until her retirement, which was in 1957. And at that point, she was almost 70, so she was really still going strong. So they worked really hard to establish their members as kind of the best that British medical art had to offer. So they encouraged hospitals and universities to employ medical artists who were members of the MAA, because it would kind of act as a bit of a seal of quality, a little bit like peer review. And they also hosted an annual conference that featured an exhibition. So this is an opportunity for medical artists not just to kind of demonstrate their work to prospective employers like hospitals and universities, but it also provided a platform where medical artists could kind of share their experience and offer guidance for artists who were just beginning in their career.
Sounds like a really supportive environment.
Yeah, I definitely think so.
What did they do to grow it?
Well, in 1961, they had a bit of a blow. So Clifford Shepley actually had to close his course at Edinburgh University because of his ill health. And then in 1957, when Dorothy Davison retired, Manchester Royal Infirmary didn't continue her traineeship. So they quickly realised it wasn't sustainable for them to try and do it all by themselves. So they enlisted the help of Sylvia Treadgold when they established the Education Committee in 1962. So Treadgold was also a very prominent medical artist. She worked down at Guy's Hospital in London, and she actually hadn't initially joined the MAA. She did meet Dorothy Davison when she went and spoke to artists to see who would be interested in joining an association, and I think they didn't really see eye to eye. Davidson was very traditional in her views. You might call her something of a purist, whereas Treadgold, on the other hand, was very forward-thinking, very technologically inclined. So she often experimented with new forms of media. She used an electric typewriter to do lettering rather than doing it all by hand. And she often produced illustrations that were quite commercial, almost like a cartoon style, and they're often sometimes humorous, which was very different to Davison's approach. And I don't think that Davison really considered Sylvia Treadgold's art to be a medical illustration.
And why were they so different? Was it part of their training, their background?
Yeah, so by this point, kind of the 1960s, there had been a shift in what medical art was generally being used for, particularly in that hospital environment that was now being run under the NHS. So at this point, medical illustrations were tending to be used for patient education rather than for training surgeons, as they previously had been. So illustrations kind of needed to be like quite simple, easy to understand, and visually appealing. So during the Second World War, for example, there had been really good success with using this kind of commercial and cartoon style for public service announcements. So this is something that they were starting to employ when they were producing, say, leaflets for patient information for public health and hygiene. So that was something that Sylvia Treadgold intended to produce quite a lot for guys. Whereas Davison, like I said, I think perhaps didn't really appreciate the need for this style of artwork.
She had a different audience.
Very much so, yeah.
So Treadgold's role in the committee, what was that?
So she basically gave their training program a complete overhaul. So whereas before a trainee medical artist might just go and stay with one established medical artist and learn solely from them, what Treadgold did was to establish a kind of curriculum that followed basically what was being offered by Johns Hopkins over in the US. So they would actually visit several different medical artists. So they would learn about different styles and specialties and different techniques. So they themselves could choose a specialty. They tended to work with graphic units. They did courses in anatomy, physiology, and pathology. So it was a lot more comprehensive than what one artist by themselves would have been able to cover.
Sounds fantastic. And did Treadgold stay with the MAA?
No, she actually didn't. So once she had established this diploma course, she actually went on to establish the Institute of Medical and Biological Illustrators, which is now known as the IMI. And these were kind of sister organizations rather than rivals. So the IMI was a broader organization that also covered people like medical photographers and medical chartists. So it tended to have a more technological focus, whereas the MAA was very much more focused on traditional art mediums. So it meant that medical artists had the chance to kind of specialize into whichever area they felt best suited them.
So we've seen a development in audiences and technologies and approaches, both in terms of, so from the artists and from the surgeons and the doctors. What about today?
It's really, really diverse. So Joanna Cameron, who is a contemporary medical artist that I've corresponded with a few times, she's actually just about to publish a new book on medical illustration. And as she puts it, today a medical artist might be asked to illustrate a surgical technique, anatomy textbook, a poster that illustrates research results, patient information leaflets, articles in medical journals, 3D models. They may even sometimes design websites that might involve videos. So it's really, really broad and diverse. So they're continuing to develop things as technology develops. So they sometimes produce things for augmented reality or virtual reality. So things that can be used for training and demonstration. And it also sometimes encompasses people like programmers as well, that produce things like mobile apps and visual software. So it's continuing to grow as both our technology and our medical understanding continues to expand.
Danielle, what makes the women that we've spoken about today so important?
Well, I think aside from their artistic talent, it's their determination to advocate for themselves and their profession. So when Dorothy Davison set up the Medical Artists Association, she asked three other artists to help her run it and to form the first committee. And that was Clifford Shepley, Audriana, and Margaret McLarty. So these people really were at the forefront of British medical illustration. So people like Arnott and McLarty really put British medical illustration on the map, and they established that reputation of quality. So unfortunately, with the way that British medical and healthcare was being run, influential surgeons like Cairns and Dot and Jefferson didn't have the same level of influence, and they weren't able to advocate for medical artists in the way that they had done before. So it was up to these women to do it for themselves. So Davison had the initiative not only to recognize that there was this problem, but to come up with a solution that empowered medical artists, and particularly female medical artists. And then, of course, without Sylvia Treadgold, the diploma and their training program probably would have collapsed. And without her experience and the breadth of her knowledge, medical artists wouldn't have had the opportunity to develop those skills and continue making the contributions that they were making.
Danielle, you work really closely with the collections here at Surgeons Hall Museums. In the time that you have worked with them, have you come across illustrations by female artists?
Yeah, there's been a few that I've been really excited to come across actually. So there's quite an early one that I came across. So it's dated 1911 and it's signed by someone called Margaret Waterston. Now, while this means that we know that by at least the early 20th century, there were women that were producing medical illustrations, that's all that we know. And this is a problem with a lot of early medical illustrations, that artists were often not credited or we know very little about them. And unfortunately, that is the case with this Margaret Waterston, is that aside from her name, we know nothing about her. Another one that I've come across that we do know a little bit more about are some Rossboard drawings that we have by an artist called Anne Brown. So Anne Brown actually worked with Clifford Shepley at Edinburgh University. And when Clifford Shepley actually retired from the medical illustration department, it was Anne Brown that took over running that department. And we have some really wonderful illustrations of her. So when they're performing things like open heart surgery, you can see these Rossboard illustrations documenting each stage of that process, which is really fantastic. We also have some more modern examples of medical illustration in the collection. So when the Body Voyager Gallery opened up in 2021, we commissioned a new series of artworks from Inishimani Mulford. And these were depicting specifically robotic surgery. So giving you a perspective of being in the operating theatre from that point of view. So it's actually quite different to a lot of the earlier medical illustrations that we have, which is fantastic.
And if our listeners, our viewers, want to be able to see medical illustrations, what would you recommend?
So a lot of the illustrations that are in our collection are available on our online search database through our catalogue. For more modern illustrations, Joanna Cameron is publishing her book in December 2024, and this gives a very modern perspective. It's generally aimed towards people who are wanting to follow a career in medical illustration, but I think it will give a really good insight into what a medical artist does today as opposed to a historic perspective. Margaret McClarty as well, in 1961, she did publish her own book, Illustrating Medicine and Surgery. And this is one of the things that made her such a big name within that sphere. She actually toured in America giving talks on the subject. So she really was regarded as an expert. So if you can find a copy of that, I think it would be really interesting to almost compare those two books to kind of see what was expected of a medical artist back in 1961 and what is expected of a medical artist today. I think that's going to be a really, really interesting comparison.
Well, thank you, Danielle, for joining us today.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Knife, a medical history podcast brought to you by Surgeons Hall Museums, Library and Archives. To find out more about us, you can visit www.museum.rcsed.ac.uk. You can also follow us on our social media channels. Join us wherever you get your podcasts.